Alright, I'm back, and this is supposed to have been done last week. And by this I mean a review, not this review, because the review I was gonna do was aborted because it wouldn't have worked, and my computer said no to everything that I did to prepare for it, so we don't have time to get our 2 review quota in for this month. I have to alter the plan. But it's okay, because I found another similar game that we're going to cover that I was supposed to cover like a year ago, and I didn't, because I actually don't even remember why. There was something happened. I just I recorded this footage, and I was like, just not do anything with it. Why would I do that? I mean, you know, I have all this footage to record, but why use it? That wouldn't make any sense. So we're going to do it now. I Am Alive. That's rock. I Am Alive is a very interesting game. It was actually made before the Tomb Raider reboot, and when I first saw the trailer I got really excited because the game is very, very similar to Tomb Raider, I guess you could say, except that it's set more in a survival sort of situation. It's not about raiding tombs, it's not about exploring temples, it's about surviving, it's about, you know, crawling over collapsed buildings and destroyed vehicles. It's a post-apocalyptic setting, but it's in like a Tomb Raider or Uncharted style platformer-esque situation, which I think is a really interesting concept, and they had a lot of ideas here that really enhance the experience. It's about survival, so you have to worry about this endurance meter that goes down as you know, climb on things or do various stuff. You have to worry about dealing with bandits. You have to worry about, you know, keeping tabs on how many bullets you have, because bullets are very scarce, you know, in this world. And you have to worry about, you know, do you have food for the day? Can you keep your endurance up so you can keep going? Different things like that really enhances this game's entire experience. But the first thing that really got me about this game was the visual style. The art direction of the game is fantastic. Everything is appropriately bleak, and it's almost a constant static white noise around you, and it enhances the atmosphere of this game, which makes it perfect, because honestly, at its core, the graphics themselves aren't super awesome. I mean, they aren't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but they aren't, you know, upscale, but it's the atmosphere that really keeps you in the zone, and you can get immersed in this sort of world that the game has presented you with. In a world where post-apocalyptic style games are hitting a cliche, this game managed to take that concept and do something very unique with it, and I like that. The gameplay overall is relatively solid, and what you would come to expect from a game of this style. It's platforming, it's climbing, there's a lot of that. The difference in this game, where compared to, say, Uncharted or Tomb Raider with their platforming, is that in this game, again, there's an endurance meter. So some comparisons may arise at Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness, which I've reviewed in the past. It also had an endurance meter. However, the endurance meter in this game, for one, doesn't suck. For two, doesn't suck. The Angel of Darkness' endurance meter was a complete waste of time and completely ruined the game for the most part, because you had this game where you had this meter and you couldn't do things before you did other things. You know, you couldn't, you know, climb across this gap without first, you know, prying a door open, then she'll feel stronger now. That doesn't happen in I Am Alive. Instead, the endurance meter is a constant thing. You can recharge it by eating food or drinking water or things of that nature, and you have to focus on it and your health meter, which are both affected by different things. The endurance meter goes down if you climb too much. That means every climbing situation you have to keep moving. You've got to keep climbing. If you stop at all, you're going to waste time, and if you waste time, you'll lower your endurance meter. If you lose your entire endurance meter, you can go into a different game mode that has the character exerting himself. However, what this will do is actually take away from the maximum endurance meter total, which goes down to a certain limit. And if you use this, well, you're going to lose how much endurance you have to work with later, because the endurance meter does go up by itself. However, its total doesn't go up unless you consume things like food. So you have to worry about this, and you have to keep an exact balance. You have to decide whether or not you want to utilize that mode, or whether or not you want to, find an outcropping and take a rest, or whether you want to use an item that's going to recharge your stamina. It's all about options. It turns what would be a very basic platformer into a thinking game, where you have to use your resources wisely and decide which ones would be better in this situation. Do you want to waste that item, or do you want to try to find a different route that may be quicker, where you wouldn't have to use an item to get through? You have to think about this stuff. And that alone is what makes this game really interesting overall. The environment, the sound effects, the core mechanics, the idea behind the game are so good, and yet it's full of these really annoying issues that I wish would have been ironed out. Because this game, I play it and I like it, I do, and I recommend you try it, especially if you like the Tomb Raider reboot, or if you like Uncharted. You may be able to enjoy this sort of thing, except for a few things that I'm gonna let you know about now. For one, the actual platforming mechanics function, however, they're not nearly as fluid as I wish they would be. If you compare them to other games, they don't work quite as well as, they'll say, in Tomb Raider. And, they're not bad, but there's two issues with it that I have that just drive me crazy. For one, you use the A button for way too much. And what I mean by that is, the A button jumps, and it also, does, jump grabs, while you're climbing. But the issue is you also have to use the A button to climb up. You can't just press up to climb up, because I don't know why. Like when you're, if you're on a ledge, you have to climb up to stand on that ledge, you have to hit the A button. And I wish you could just press up, because the problem, runs, if you press it too early, you end up jumping and wasting stamina, and that can really affect, future climbs if you use too much stamina. In addition, another thing that drives me crazy is that jumping is only allowed when the game says it's allowed. I think this is to keep you from jumping to your death like an idiot, but I've made this point with other games before. Guys, let me mess up, alright? If I jump to my death like a fucking moron, that's my fault. And I should have to suffer the consequences for that mistake. It's very simple. I think I know why they did this, because in order to make the world look more expansive, there are areas that look like you would be able to walk on. However, there's no way to get to them because you can't jump. And that's kind of the point. And they'll let you jump in areas that are allowed, but in other areas, specifically to keep you from trying to get to areas you're not supposed to go, you're not allowed to jump. And honestly, that's kind of a big deal. I understand they didn't want to make the world look too restrictive and they wanted to make it look more open, but the problem is it isn't as open as it is. It just looks like it is. And it's a hindrance to the overall gameplay experience. Another thing about the game that is kind of sort of a half problem is the way you interact with enemies. And this is something that was really touted by the developers. It's something that really excited me. Because with enemies, it's not just a firefight. It's not like, Uncharted or The Last of Us where you just, shoot and you're in cover-based combat. No, that doesn't exist here. Every single interaction with an enemy has to do with survival. And every time you meet a group of enemies, you have to handle it differently. And the idea is that you have to look and see what the enemies are holding, what kind of weapons do they have, how many of them are there, and which order you should take the enemies out in. For example, if you run into an area where, one of the enemies has a gun, it's best to take him out first. Not only will you get rid of that big threat, but you'll be able to take his bullet and then use it on the other enemies. You also want to decide whether or not you want to engage at all. Some enemies, aren't really in it to kill you, they just want you out of their territory because they're in survival mode. So sometimes it's best to just back off and leave them as they were. You don't need to engage them if you don't have to. It's all about making that decision, and I really like this. My big complaint about the enemies' interaction is, the enemy AI, there's a lot to work with here, but it's not as deep as you'd think. The enemies only react to certain things in a very specific way, and there's no flexibility with it. For example, I think the deepest part of the enemy's AI has to do with the gun. Enemies will react to guns in different ways, depending on how they're armed. For example, if you see an enemy that has a gun, and you want to try to hold them up, I recommend not doing that. because what they'll do is they'll just shoot you. Like, if you shoot them first, you know, and get the first shot off quick, you might be fine, but then you're using a bullet, and then you're wasting that bullet that could be used, you know, in a better situation. It's much better to wait for the enemy to approach you and then stealth kill them, because they aren't going to want to shoot you unless they have to, because they have to save their bullet. In addition, sometimes you may want to think about holding up enemies to intimidate them, even if you don't have a bullet. This can work, but you have to be careful about this, because A, if you accidentally fire your gun when there's no bullets in it, it'll click. The enemies will hear that, and they'll know that you don't have a bullet to use. So they'll approach you and start attacking because they know you won't fire. Another thing is that as you hold them up too long, they may start to think that you don't have a bullet in there, even if you do. And they may try to attack you because they don't think you have a bullet, or because they think you don't have the guts to actually shoot them. In those situations, you may actually have to expend a bullet. It all depends on what kind of situation you're in. But as interesting as these mechanics sound, it's not as deep as I'd like them to be, mainly because of one major flaw. There's no way to actually talk the enemies down. There's no button to press to say, hey, look, just back off, I'm just gonna go on my way, there's no problem. The enemies will not leave you alone once you're in an engagement situation unless they surrender. You can't order the enemies to back down, but this is used as more of an aggressive tactic, because the idea is to back them into the edge of a cliff, or, you know, into a fire, and then kick them, you know, and kill them that way, to, you know, so you don't expend a bullet. But there's no way to just say, look, I'm just passing through, just leave me alone. There's no way to interact with them in that manner. And I really don't like that, because it would open up another door for another option, because I feel like some of these enemies, you know, not every enemy in this game, because of the way the game is set, is out to kill. That's not what, you know, all of them want to do. So you might be able to just say, look, I'm not here to take your stuff, I'm not here to cause a problem, I'm just going to pass through, you know, I won't shoot you if you don't try to kill me, and they'll be like, fine, just go, just leave us alone, and, you know, that'd be interesting, but that doesn't really happen. It only happens if the enemies, you know, aren't interested in attacking you, and you can just pass them by, but there's no way to talk enemies down, and I wish that was a function, I really do. Another problem with them is that another weapon you'll get later on is the bow and arrow, which is really useful because the idea is that you can shoot an enemy with an arrow, but then go and pick that arrow up and reuse it. So you're not expending a resource as long as you pick the arrow back up. My issue with the bow and arrow is that while enemies are really intimidated by guns, they don't really seem to care about the bow, and I don't know why. I've had it where, you know, enemies will just straight up run at me because I have a bow, and I'll be like, I'm gonna get you, and then I shoot them in the face with an arrow. I don't know why they're not intimidated by the bow at all. I guess the developer was going for the idea that guns are intimidating and bows really don't look that intimidating, but I'm sorry, I feel like not every enemy should be this fucking stupid, because I don't care, you know, whether it's a bow or a gun. Both have the means to kill me, and if someone has one of those pointed at me, I'm not gonna rush at them with a machete. These enemies like to do that, with the bow at least. They're intimidated by the gun. You know, the gun will work, but the bow, not so much. I don't think I would have made that design choice. It just makes the enemies look frickin' stupid, to be honest. If it sounds like I'm telling you that this game is terrible and you shouldn't play it, I'm not. I just feel like there was more they could have done here. This is such a workable concept. This is something that could be really, really interesting, and it does what it does well, but it doesn't do enough. It just falls short at being fantastic. I mean, another gameplay element is actually whether or not you want to help out other people outside the main story. Because, you know, on your travels you'll meet other survivors, and not all of them are bandits. Some of them, you know, will need your help, and with all of them, some of them need an item, you know, like a first aid kit, for example. And you have to sit there and decide whether you want to take the time to help them. You may have a first aid kit, but then you have to consider, hey, you know, I may need to use that. And you know, you can give it to them, sure, but then that's one, you know, item you won't have to use. Then you have to consider, if you don't have one, you know, is it worth taking the time to go find one for these people? You know, is it better to just leave them, you know, to their own devices and let them fend for themselves? Or do you want to try to be a nice guy? It's a matter of choice. But another complaint I have is the only way to recharge the endurance meter, you know, once it's all the way down to its lowest limit, is by consuming resources, which makes sense, I suppose, and I'm fine with that element. But my big problem with this is there's no way to just rest and just let your muscles recharge. I mean, yes, the meter will bounce back on its own normally, but if you have to exert yourself, you won't be able to recharge that without consuming some kind of item. And I wish there was a way to rest and recharge it. And you may say, well, isn't that a little broken? Then you just be able to rest every time you get a chance, and you'll always have a full endurance gauge. And yes, that makes sense. But another element I wish they would have implemented here at least a little bit better is the idea of a time limit. You know, maybe you can't be outside for a certain amount of time because of the atmosphere. Because one of the disasters in this apocalyptic scenario is that there's a huge amount of dust in the air, and the dust actually lowers your endurance gauge gradually if you're stuck in it for a while. Even if you do have a gas mask, it still goes down by a bit. And you have to be careful. You actually have to exert yourself and climb out of the dust every so often so you can breathe clearly. But the endurance gauge always bounces back. What I would have preferred here is maybe there's a certain time limit. You can only be outside for a certain amount of time before you have to go back in. Sort of like Phantom Dust, if any of you have played that game, which is a really good game for the original Xbox, by the way. I think the time limit in that game, from a plot perspective was, like 15 minutes, but I think the actual, game, only had, a 5-minute time limit. Don't quite remember, it's been a few years since I played it. But maybe in this game, since the world's more open, maybe you can only be outside for a half hour at a time. And there would be a rest function where, yeah, you can sit down and rest and recharge your endurance gauge fully, but then you'll lose 5 or 10 minutes off of your total time to be outside to reach your objective. It would be another element to consider from a survival perspective. And yes, I'm well aware that's kind of a really good idea. And honestly, if the developer is watching this, if you're going to make a sequel, which I don't think you are, but if you are, you can totally use that idea. In fact, you could, hire me. I'll work for you. That's cool. I got more ideas. I'm good at this. I went to school, alright? For stuff. And I know stuff. Kinda. This is a bad job interview already. Not that this is a job interview at all, it's a game review. Your game is really good. Will that help me get hired? Probably not. Anyway, as I was saying, I just wish they would have done more. It's such an interesting concept, and it just doesn't do as much as I wish it could. It has so much potential, and it's not bad at all. It's not. It really isn't, and it's definitely worth a play. But I just wish they had taken the gameplay to different heights. I mean, maybe they just ran out of dev time. I mean, it's also a downloadable game, and I doubt it had a massive budget to work with, so you have to consider that. And for what they were working with, I think they did quite a lot here. I just wish they had been given the means to do more is all. That being said, you may notice I've avoided talking about the story of this game, and the story is really good. It is. I love the story, but my god, does it kick you right in the teeth when it comes to depressing. I mean, this is such a bleak tale, and it might actually make you cry. The ending is really, really sad. I mean, honestly. And the best part about the ending is that it doesn't even have to say a word. It doesn't. What happens, happens, and it doesn't tell you that it happened. I'm not going to spoil it. I suggest you actually play the game. I genuinely do recommend this game. As much as I've tried to complain about it, I mean, my problems have to do with the fact that I wish they would have done more with it, but for what they've done here, it's still an interesting, unique, and fun experience. And like I said, if you're a fan of games like survival platformers like the Tomb Raider reboot or even Uncharted, I think you'd get a lot of fun out of this. To be brutally honest, it is definitely worth a play. Plus, it's downloadable, so you have to consider that. It's a lot cheaper than a retail release. And I think it's available on 360, PS3, and PC, so by all means, if you haven't given this game a chance, please do. It's well worth your time. And with that, till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.